Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon or good evening. On behalf of the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues and the American Psychological Association, we thank you for joining us for this important side event entitled Using Disaggregated Data to Inform Human Rights Policies and Practices to Combat Systemic Racism and Racial Ethnic Discrimination against People of African Descent. We know that many of you are joining us in the very early hours of the morning and some quite late in the evening, so thank you. Before I continue, please note that we have interpreters available who will provide a simultaneous interpretation in English, French, or Spanish. If you wish to select one of these languages and you are using a computer or a tablet, please scroll to the bottom of your screen. You will see a world icon. Click that icon and you can select the language you would like to hear the presentations in. If you are using a cell phone, you may see 3 dots on the bottom right of your screen. If you click on those dots, you then see a prompt for language interpretation. And again, you can click the language you wish to listen in. This event is being run in parallel with the first permanent forum of people of African descent, which will be held next week at the United Nations European offices in Geneva, Switzerland, December 5th through the 8th. Today's side event is intended to call attention to the vital need for United Nations member states to employ data disaggregation to measure progress more effectively for all segments of their population in attaining each of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And hereinafter, we'll just refer to them as SDGs. I'd like to give you a little background on how the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues, or we call it SPSSI, how the SPSSI UN team has come to identify data disaggregation as a critical tool for addressing systemic racism and as a successful strategy for achieving the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. In September 2020, the SPSSI UN team, led by SPSSI UN team member Dr. Koran Okorodudu, launched an anti-racism campaign intended to go beyond the human rights rhetoric of leaving no one behind. As some of you may recall, the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, launched now 7 years ago by the General Assembly, promised that the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development will fulfill human rights to equality and non-discrimination across the 17 goals, leaving no one behind. SPSSI's UN team conducted a content analysis of the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals framework. This analysis revealed that although the introduction to the SDGs is visionary in its stated commitment to protect and fulfill human rights for all and to end racial, gender, and other forms of discrimination prohibited by international law, the goals, the targets, and global indicators developed to evaluate progress on the attainment of the SDGs fails to reflect an equally robust focus on this most important human rights commitment. The SDGs, targets, and global indicators are all disturbingly silent about the eradication of systemic racism and racial and ethnic discrimination, which constitutes global barriers to human development and to the fulfillment of human rights throughout the lifespan. Despite a call by several UN human rights experts for disaggregated data for groups protected by international law, and although a mandate for disaggregated data is included within the SDGs framework, only limited attention has been focused on disaggregation in some of the most dehumanizing contexts of discrimination, namely discrimination affecting racial and ethnic populations. While the call for disaggregated data by income, sex, age, race, ethnicity, migratory status, and disability, among others, appears at the top of the initial list of the 230 indicators. Researchers have found that the list does not include a single indicator specifically requiring disaggregation by race or ethnicity, even in SDG number 10, which focuses on reducing inequalities. Our analysis of the most recent update of the Global Indicators Framework in 2020 shows a slight increase in the inclusion of race and ethnicity from 0 to 5 indicators. Only 2 of the 169 targets and approximately 5 out of the 231 current global indicators require disaggregated data on race and ethnicity. And as such, for the foreseeable future, these factors are likely to continue to be sidelined in the monitoring of the SDGs, resulting in the absence of useful information that could be available to member states and other stakeholders for reducing existing systemic racial and ethnic discrimination, as well as intersecting inequalities. With this as a backdrop, the SPSSI UN team launched our current campaign to encourage UN member states to endorse the need for data disaggregation and to work to develop and adopt indicators that would allow for disaggregated data analysis, specifically with respect to race, ethnicity, and indigenous status on the 17 SDGs. We are very pleased to report that the missions of Costa Rica, Mexico, and South Africa have worked with us to advocate for the need for disaggregated data at the past 2 UN high-level political forums in 2021 and 2022. We continue to work with these and other missions going forward. The voluntary national reviews published by these 3 countries that evaluate their success in achieving the SDGs also underscore their commitment to the need to disaggregate data for racial and ethnic minorities. With this campaign, SPSSI, APA, and our co-sponsors and partners continue to advocate for member states to undertake the following activities. First, monitor and evaluate progress on all SDGs by using indicators disaggregated by race, ethnicity, descent, national origin, indigenous identity, age, sex, income, language, religion, disability, migratory status, geographic locations, and other characteristics relevant to national context. 2, invest urgently with the leadership and support of the UN Statistical Commission in efforts to significantly increase the availability of high-quality, timely, and reliable SDG data, disaggregated by the factors that I've listed above. 3, develop partnerships in developing countries to enhance their technical capacities for generating disaggregated data and statistics, consistent with SDG 17, initial target 17.18. 4, include in the member states' voluntary national reviews, which are developed to assess the progress of the SDGs, indicators and data on race, ethnicity, and other cultural categories from their reports to the existing UN mechanisms, and use such data to monitor compliance with human rights standards, especially compliance with the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Universal Periodic Reviews of the Human Rights Council. 5, speed up urgent contributions to the International Decade for People of African Descent by member states and all stakeholders in support of the theme, quote, recognition, justice, and development, end quote, through strong, concrete actions to fulfill the economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights of people of African descent through the SDGs. And finally, given the multiple factors that intersect to influence human development, use different categories of group disaggregated data to discover and address developmental risks associated with different intersecting forms of social group identity or oppression. Once again, if you joined us just a few minutes ago, please note that we have interpreters who will provide simultaneous interpretation in English, French, and Spanish. To choose your preferred language, if you are using a laptop or other computer, please scroll to the bottom of your screen, find the world icon, click on that icon, and select your language. If you are joining us on cell phone, look for 3 dots at the bottom right part of your screen, click on those dots, then go to a drop-down that indicates language interpretation and select the language you would like to listen in. We have 4 outstanding speakers today who will be calling on in just a moment to share with you their expertise and their work and their knowledge about data disaggregation in the various fields that they work in. But for the moment, I'd like to invite our partner, Dr. Amanda Clinton, the Senior Director of the International Office at the American Psychological Association, to bring a few words of greeting. Dr. Clinton.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ragin. It's always an honor and a bit intimidating to follow you because you just absolutely have this natural ability to, and so knowledgeable. So thank you for having me here. On behalf of myself, and I would also like to recognize my colleague, Dr. Gabrielle Tooze, who is the Senior International Affairs Officer at the Office of International Affairs at the APA. Together with me, without his hard work, this wouldn't have been possible. But between the APA and our colleagues who support our global efforts through the Global Psychology Alliance, I simply wanted to say greetings, welcome. I've had the honor to hear some of our speakers in the past, and they were nothing short of brilliant. I feel like a grad student taking notes, to be honest, learned a tremendous amount and felt really appreciative to support, I think, broadening our perspectives and understanding. We know that racism is a global issue, and certainly that the structures and systems that support racism are global issues. As psychologists, scientists, we need to support meaningful, effective, and honest, transparent use of data where we have the opportunity to do so in support of advancement of human rights. That is, I think, always part of our organizational missions, but our personal and individual professional reasons for becoming psychologists. But APA is very concerned about and desirous of taking action based on science to address the issue of systemic racism together with all of you here today. And I wanted to express real gratitude to the Society for Psychological Study of Social Issues for their leadership. Their work group and experts are truly extraordinary. I think the summary we just heard certainly highlights that, as well as PCUN for being part of this team that is helping open. I guess we're here and we're very fortunate to be hosting this forum on the day of the beginning of the UN recognition of the need to combat systemic racism against people of African descent. And so APA looks forward very much to continued partnership and appreciates the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you for, again, your partnership in this endeavor. Again, just a reminder, I see it in the chat, there are 3 languages of interpretation for this presentation. If you would like to choose French, English, or Spanish, please scroll down to the bottom of your screen, find the world icon, click on that icon, and select your preferred language. If you're using a cell phone, you'll find 3 dots at the bottom right of your screen, click on those dots, and then follow the prompts to find your preferred language. We are fortunate to have with us today 4 distinguished presenters who have specific expertise in the development, implementation, and policy application of data disaggregation, specifically as it relates to efforts to eliminate systemic racism and inequality. We are going to hear first from each of the 4 presenters. And then after they've all presented, we're going to open a question and answer session with our listeners. We ask that you please submit your questions at any time during the presentation or afterwards, or your comments using the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And if you haven't done so already, please, again, remember to choose your preferred language. I do see already that there are people that are adding comments and questions, and I'm very thankful that you're doing that already. We're going to hold those until after all 4 presenters have spoken, and then we'll include your comments and questions at that time. Our first speaker is Dr. Kelley Haynes-Mendez. She is the Senior Director of the Human Rights Team for the American Psychological Association. And she's who is one of the co-sponsors of this webinar, as you've heard. And they've also partnered with SPSSI to push to advocate for integrating data disaggregation into the SDGs analysis framework. Dr. Haynes-Mendez will address the need for a whole of society perspective or systems approach to the elimination of systemic racism, which coincidentally is the title of her presentation. Dr. Haynes-Mendez.
Thank you so much. I am so excited to be here and really appreciate the opportunity to talk a bit about systemic racism. The purpose of my presentation is to provide some definitions around racism. How we look at racism, I think, gets us to a better understanding of the systemic impact of racism also. So I'll spend some time sort of defining different levels of racism and speaking to this idea that approaching the elimination of racism with a systems approach provides more immediate and long-term impact and influence. Okay. So in 2021, the American Psychological Association started thinking through psychology's own history as it relates to systemic racism, and also developing a uniform understanding of racism at many levels. So one of the definitions that we are presently using is that racism is a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on phenotypic or physical properties such as skin color, hair texture, and other characteristics in other countries globally. So the system itself may range from daily interpersonal interactions shaped by race to opportunities based on racialized outcomes for good education, housing, employment, etc. And racism would also unfairly disadvantage people belonging to marginalized racial groups and damage their health and mental health. Racism also then unfairly advantages individuals belonging to socially and politically dominant racial groups based on their context. And so overall, we sort of come to the table with an understanding that racism ultimately undermines the full potential of the whole society. And so next, I want to talk about 4 levels of racism. Those levels are internalized, interpersonal, institutional, and structural. And I'll go through each one of these and speak a little bit to the relevance of systemic racism at these various levels. So first, internalized racism is referring to the acceptance by diverse racial populations of negative societal beliefs and stereotypes about themselves. So when we think about individuals from marginalized, racialized groups and communities, those individuals might be feeling worthless or devalued based on their acceptance and belief in those negative stereotypes that society holds about their community or group. We see this very much in the field and practice of psychology, having individuals believing negative stereotypes about themselves also impacts mental health outcomes. And so therapists and practitioners can often work toward alleviating some of those beliefs in psychotherapy and in other ways in order to develop better outcomes mental health wise for people who hold some of these stereotypes about themselves. Interpersonal racism is racism that occurs between or in relationship to others. So when we sort of think about racism, when we think about bigotry and prejudice at an interpersonal dimension, I think that we are often defining racism within this level. Interpersonal racism occurs when individuals from socially and politically dominant racial groups behave in ways that diminish and harm people who belong to other racial groups. Interpersonal racism can include negative attitudes. It can include preconceived opinions about individuals from other groups. But overall, this is something that occurs between two individuals in relationship to each other. And then at the institutional level is when we begin to see what it means, what systemic racism looks like and what that means. And so institutional racism then can result from policies, practices, and procedures of institutions. Those institutions can be institutions of higher education, they can be law enforcement organizations, criminal justice systems, that serve to marginalize diverse racial groups. And then finally, we have structural racism, and structural racism results from laws, policies, and practices that produce cumulative, durable, and race-based inequalities. And so when we think about how we can have an impact at the structural and institutional level, it is our responsibility then to change the structures that reproduce and reinforce systemic inequalities in access and representation. And so the 4 levels of racism are mutually reinforcing. And so when we are thinking about best practices and how to eliminate systemic racism or how to eliminate racism in general, we have to look at all 4 levels. If we are looking at interpersonal or internalized racism only in our practices and not addressing institutional and structural racism, those institutional systemic types of policies, practices, and procedures will continue. We will continue to have racialized outcomes and inequities if we are only serving internalized and interpersonal levels of racism. And so this is the argument as to why we need to look at also institutional and structural levels at the systemic level of racism. And with that said, I want to offer an example from a sociologist who writes about racialized outcomes. And so Dr. Victor Ray, has done research around why organizations at the institutional level of systemic racism maintain whiteness. How is it that institutions and systems are able to maintain these very sort of concrete outcomes when it relates to race and racial inequalities? And so he talks about the level of individual discrimination versus systemic discrimination. And so, for instance, if an employer at an institution is using racist language, that is an interpersonal level of racism. The human resources, best practices, and organizations might respond to that type of racism in the workplace. However, if we were thinking about this organization as someone or as an organization that had discriminatory promotion procedures or has outcomes that makes it where only privileged workers are receiving resources from the organization, or if the organization is having a negative impact on marginalized communities, that isn't necessarily being addressed when it comes to racism. And so this idea that we are oftentimes targeting interpersonal racism in the workplace and in systems and organizations, but we are not necessarily using that same approach and addressing these more systemic, outcomes-oriented racism practices at the systems level. And so how can we eliminate systemic racism? And I think the other presenters will go into some detail about this. So the first step for eliminating systemic racism is to understand the dynamics of racialized outcomes. And disaggregated data will help to do this, to really understand what are the outcomes, what do the racialized outcomes look like for this particular area, this organization, this institution, or this structure. And then the second piece is creating processes to both discover and address those outcomes. So we need to better understand what are the outcomes in order to fully address them. I wanted to end by talking a little bit about some of the work that APA has done in this area. We released a series of new policies within the last year, looking at the role of psychology and the American Psychological Association in dismantling systemic racism against people of color in the US. And so that was sort of step one in our process. After that, we conducted a comprehensive and association-wide audit to establish a critical baseline from which the association could move forward in its racial equity planning. Following the audit, the association began to develop strategic priorities for its racial equity work in order to help eliminate some of the systemic racism that was identified, the racialized outcomes that were first identified in the racial equity audit. After that, the association did bring in a group of experts in race and ethnicity and had a racial equity think tank and virtual summit to form what became the basis of the Racial Equity Action Plan. And then based on consultation, the association is looking at 5 specific areas to address systemic racism. And of course, systemic racism is not limited to these areas, but through the study and research in this particular process, these were identified as sort of the baseline areas where we would be looking to impact systemic racism in psychology and in society as well. So the first is knowledge production, integrating equitable and inclusive approaches to research and scholarship that center the experiences of people of color. Health, using the full breadth of psychology to advance health equity in communities of color. APA and the psychology workforce to promote equity, diversity, and inclusion principles within APA and within the broader psychology workforce. The training of psychologists to promote racially conscious and equitable training that opens pathways to students of color to pursue successful careers in psychology. And then finally, in education, which would address racial inequities in educational settings, namely early childhood, kindergarten through 12, undergraduate, and also psychology graduate programs. And here are some references. And again, thank you so much for the time. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Haynes-Mendez. That was a wonderful presentation. I'm judging not just on the basis of what I've heard, but the number of questions that have already been posed in the chat. So I'm going to just keep us moving because I want to be able to get to a number of these wonderful comments and questions. So be prepared, stay tuned. Our next speaker is Ms. Carole Schmitz. and we're pleased to welcome her. Ms. Schmitz holds a master's degree in mathematical sciences and specializing in probability and statistics. She is currently the Deputy Director General of the Population and Housing Census at the National Institute of Statistics and Geography in Aguascalientes, Mexico. And in this position, she directs the activities of design, planning, processing, documentation, evaluation, and quality control of population and housing censuses, counts, and related surveys. That's a big synthesis for a big job, and I'm sure that she'll tell us a little bit more about exactly how all that works in her presentation. She is going to be talking about contribution of data disaggregation in the elimination of systemic racism. Ms. Schmitz is going to be presenting in Spanish, so if you prefer English or French, please make sure to go to the world icon at the bottom of your screen, select your language, and continue. Thanks very much. Ms. Schmitz.
Thank you, Deborah. Buenos días a todos. Es un gusto estar.
Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today at this forum. Today, I'm going to be talking about Mexico's experience in capturing the Afro-Mexican or Afro-descendant population in Mexico. In Mexico, we were able to conduct the population census in 2020. We know that due to the COVID pandemic, a lot of countries delayed their census or even cancelled their census. Fortunately, we were able to carry it out in March 2020. The objective of the population census is to produce information about the dimension, structure, and spatial distribution of the population, as well as its main socioeconomic and cultural characteristics, and also to obtain account of housing and some of its characteristics. The results of the 2020 census in Mexico show that there is a continuation of economic trends and social trends. The census is the only statistical exercise that is exhaustive in nature, so we go to all the homes in the country and we capture information about all the residents, all the habitual residents, with an informant who conducts a survey, who is someone above the age of 18, who understands the situation of each of the occupants in the home. For the first time, we used computing mobile devices to register and record information, but we also had complementary measures such as self-numeration on the internet or an assisted interview on the phone, as well as the use of a number of questionnaires on paper for exceptional cases. The information in the 2020 census has been referred, or it refers to the 15th of March 2020, and with these results, in Mexico, we were able to count 126 million people, or 1.2 billion people, which is number 11 in terms of population at the global level. And as a country, we've seen that we're now going into a gradual aging process. The average age was 22 in 2000, 2010 it was 26, and for 2020, the average age is 29. And now, going into the topic of Afro-descendants in the census, in the international context, this topic is of utmost importance, and it's of utmost importance for 2020 because it's carried out within the international decade of Afro-descendants in which the states are motivated to obtain information about this population. So with that, we were able to take action to ensure that in this particular exercise, this question was included, and also as a response to the commitments that Mexico has signed, such as the International Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination and Agreement 169 of the International Labour Organization, and also 2030 Agenda on the Montevideo Consensus. So within the national context, the objective of including this question in the census was to be able to provide to the communities and to the Afro-Mexican communities and Afro-descendants communities information to be able to follow on Section D of this law in Mexico, where they're acknowledged as part of the pluricultural composition of the country, and it is established that they have a right to self-determination, autonomy, development, and social inclusion. With the information of the census, they provide data that help to develop the provisions of the law from the National Institute of Indigenous Peoples, with coordinated and systematic action in the area of the provision of services and infrastructure. And this information from the census also allows us to contribute data to the National Programme for Indigenous Peoples with regards to the action lines for the consolidation of a regional proposal from the Indigenous and Afro-Mexican peoples to build a system of statistical information on Indigenous and Afro-Mexican populations and communities. So the application of this question already has a context in Mexico from the Intercensus question of 2015. Nevertheless, this question isn't easy to apply. We must remember that in a census, the magnitude of human resources, economic and material resources that you require,
El ejercicio estadístico sin duda más
in the
grande.
statistical exercise, which is the biggest statistical exercise that a country performs, you must have short questionnaires with questions that are easy to understand and ones that are easy for the entire population to understand. Before the 2020 census, we worked with academia, but we also worked with a number of Afro-Mexican organizations to define the way we would phrase this question that was going to be included in the census. And later on, in some of the results that I'm going to present to you, you can see that there is definitely a geographic concentration of for the Afro-Mexican population. They're obviously present across the country as a whole, but they're specifically or predominantly in a specific area of the country. This implies that in those regions where they are less present, even though efforts have been made to raise awareness, a considerable part of our informants did not understand the term Afro-Mexican or Afro-descendant.
Algunas pruebas para en
And we
algunas
also did some tests with some of the questions that only included the term Afro-Mexican, which is the term in our constitution. But we saw that by phrasing it this way, they gave us biased information because the informants only used the word Mexican, and they responded that they were in fact Mexican when we were actually trying to ask whether they were Afro-Mexican or Afro-descendants. Part of these Afro-descendant organizations also requested that we just include the term Afro-Mexican rather than Afro-descendant, but given that a census has to include the totality of the population, there is obviously there are obviously certain populations in Mexico that are Afro-descendants and not Mexicans. So for our interviewers, we also had to emphasize on this in training. And even after making use of mobile computing devices in the training, we included another definition that you will be able to see on the screen and that we were working on with colleagues from academia, so that if there were any doubts about the question of what an Afro-Mexican is or an Afro-descendant, our interviewers would be able to read this definition instead of trying to provide a definition in their own words, because we saw that this wasn't yielding good results. Because at the INEGI, it's also very important for us to capture information, but it must be good quality information that adequately reflects the characteristics that we're looking to capture, or the populations. So this question was included in the basic questionnaire, so the one that's applied universally, and then in the wider questionnaire that's applied only in a certain probabilistic sample of houses, we also have a specific questionnaire for social assistance areas. The premise for the formulation of this question was to apply it to people of all ages, to consider the criteria of Afro-Mexican or Afro descendant identity to be able to acknowledge that and allude to ethonyms that are linked to Afro-descendants. So, for example, according to your traditions and to previous generations, what do you call yourselves? Because some of them consider that they are Afro-Mexican, they say Black sometimes, or Afro-descendants. And so they only have two options for this question, which is yes or no. The results of this question in the 2020 census show that there are 2,576,213 people who identify as Afro-Mexican or Afro-descendant, which represents 2% of the total population. 50.4% of them are women and 49.6% are men.
Esta población es de 32 años, es una población
The average
ligeramente
age is 32. They're slightly older than the average age for the nation as a whole. As we said, it's important to include the term Afro-descendant as well,
afromexicana o afrodescendiente, el 98.
because in this Mexican or Afro-descendant population, 43% was born in Mexico, but 1.6 was also born in another, sorry, 98.3 were born in Mexico and 1.6% were born in another country. So 29% of this small percentage were born in the US, 13.8% in Cuba, 10.9% in Venezuela, 9.3% in Haiti. There are also Afro-descendants from Honduras, Colombia, Guatemala, Brazil, Dominican Republic, and El Salvador. If we analyze the characteristics of the Afro-descendant or Afro-Mexican population and compare them to national data,
En global, esta
we can
población
see that at a general level, this population has more or less similar characteristics to the national population. For example, we can see their average level of schooling. The average level for the national population is 11.7 years old. And for Afro-descendants, it's slightly higher. Nevertheless, and this is where it's important to disaggregate the data. These indicators, if you disaggregate them, will show more significant differences. So as I was saying before, the Afro-Mexican population is concentrated in certain regions of the country. So we can see here we can see Guerrero, Oaxaca, Veracruz, and Ciudad de Mexico. We can see that 46.5% of the population is located in these areas in terms of the people that self-identify as Afro-Mexican or Afro-descendants. And then if we disaggregate that even more, we can see here in the state of Guerrero that there are municipalities such as Coajimalpa, where they have 79.9% of the population that identifies as Afro-Mexican or Afro-descendant in that state. So I'll show you an example here about the same or from the same municipality, which is a municipality where there are 26,627 people, of which practically 80% self-identify as Afro-Mexican, and of which 49.8% are men and the rest are women. If we look at the left-hand side of this slide, we'll see information for this particular municipality, and then on the right we can find national data. So here, for example, we can see that in the municipality of Guerrero, 10.2% of housing have soil flooring, whereas it varies at the national level. We can also see that in terms of availability of services and facilities, the Afro-Mexican or Afro-descendant population, 24% of their houses have water pipelines, whereas at the global level it's 77.6%. 88.4% have drainage, in Coahuila have the service, and which is less than 95.5%, which is the national percentage. In fact, at the level of the availability of electrical energy, which is basically an indicator that is almost 100% in the entire country. In this particular municipality, 98.1% of houses have electrical energy, whereas the indicator at the national level is 99%. So when you actually disaggregate that geographically, you can start to see significant gaps. And it's the same when it comes to the availability of IT technology and communications.
De las viviendas
So
disponen de una
12.4% of houses in this municipality have computers, whereas at the national level, the indicator is 37.6%. 16% only of the houses in this municipality have internet, and the indicator at the national level is 52.1%. The same occurs with the availability of goods. So 58% of houses, just to give you an example, in this municipality of Guerrero have a washing machine, and at the national level, the indicator is 72.8%. And then for the characteristics of persons as such, we see the same pattern. So in this municipality, 17.1% of the population has not been to school, and the indicator for population without education at the national level is 4.9%. And then on the other hand, in Coahuila, 8.5% of the population has some degree of higher education, whereas at the national level, the indicator is 21.6%. So this really shows us the importance of breaking down the data, both in terms of Afro-Mexican and Afro-Descendant population, but also at the geographical level and the thematic level as well. This is the great advantage of the population censuses, because they must by nature obviously have restricted themes and themes that are easy to understand in the country as a whole. Only a population census would allow you to perform this kind of disaggregation at such a granular level to offer really detailed information that can be followed up on to help plan public policy. Obviously, at the Institute, the question about Afro-descendants is being included in home surveys.
con un tamaño de muestra limitado, este
But
tipo
because
de
they are probabilistic in nature with a limited budget, this disaggregation at the municipal level or with specific populations with of different ages and other characteristics, it may not be possible unless you have a population census. So currently at the INEGI, we are preparing the count of the population and housing for 2025, and it's not it's exhaustive in nature, but the themes will be a little bit more limited compared to the exercises that we perform between censuses due to budget restrictions. In 2015, we performed an inter-census questionnaire. Now we're planning to perform a head count, especially given the importance of having data about what happened to the population,
demográfica 5 años del inicio.
demographical dynamics after 5 years, especially since the pandemic started. And in public consultation, we also want to include questions about Afro-descendants, and we want to include that in the basic survey and also the social assistance survey. So if you wish to participate in our public consultation, it is available on the INEGI page until the 5th of December, where the population and the institutions are contributing their observations and their needs for information in this statistical project in the intercensus period.
En México para
We've also been working in Mexico to disaggregate the SDG indicators for subpopulations of interest. For example, people who speak indigenous languages, people with disabilities, sex, Afro descendants, migrants, depending on their place of birth and nationality, changes of residence after 5 years, and also migrants that are returning, as well as users of shelters. So this is something we're working on for all indicators, but
no contienen todas las temáticas que permiten estas
some
desagregaciones.
sources do not have all these themes to allow us to disaggregate the data,
Encuestas
or
probabilísticas.
sometimes they have already disaggregated the data. So because these come from surveys, they lose statistical quality. Okay, that would be all. Thank you very much for inviting us today.
Sarah, if you could put me back on screen so that we can move to the next person. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Carole Schmitz, for a fantastic presentation. I'll admit to being a little privy to some of the work that Jenny does, and was not at all surprised by the extent and the depth of the work that you have explained to us. Of course, that has generated a number of questions, so stay tuned. We're going to come back to you with a number of questions about both what you did and how others could emulate, and comparisons to others that may be doing something similar. Our next speaker, again, I'm keeping this moving because I can see from the chat function that we have a lot of questions that are coming in. Our next question is Dr. Phan, who is an equity data expert consultant, currently supporting Toronto, Canada's police service and their groundbreaking anti-racism data initiative. And she works collectively with colleagues, partners, stakeholders, and communities to support an evidence-based systems approach to racial equity, human rights, and inclusion. I'll take a moment to say, I saw some questions and some comments when Ms. Schmitz was speaking about police work, but I think that was also in the UK. So there may be some fertile ground here for cross collaboration and consultation. Dr. Phan has over 20 years of experience teaching, researching, and developing and leading initiatives to address systemic barriers and to promote inclusive practices and policies in public sector organizations. Her presentation is entitled Using Disaggregated Data to Assess and Eliminate Systemic Racism in the Lives of People of African Descent. Dr. Phan.
Thank you very much. I had to unmute myself. I really appreciate the introduction. And I want to start my presentation. It's going to be a little bit of a different tack in that I want to talk about some of the legislative and policy tools that could be really helpful and instrumental to ensuring that disaggregated data, particularly collected and used to address unique systemic racisms that people of African descent experience. And I want to start, my presentation by acknowledging the land that I'm standing on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, Métis peoples. And I also acknowledge that Toronto, on which I work and live, is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We also acknowledge that we're all treaty peoples, including those who came here as settlers, as migrants in this generation or in generations past, and those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. And I offer this land acknowledgement on this international stage as a reminder that we're all rooted somewhere, and the places we find ourselves currently have histories and stories to which we are now bound and owe responsibilities for. This relates to collecting, managing, and using data ethically and equitably. And to do that, we must confront our history and honestly assess who we are against who we want to be. So in my presentation to you today, I give my perspective on the importance of addressing systemic racism in Canada and a key barrier to collecting race and identity-based data, which is fear of change and what taking an anti-racist approach entails. So an anti-racist approach is a process and a systematic method of analysis. It is a proactive course of action that is rooted in the recognition of the existence of racism, including systemic racism. And the legacy of settler colonialism and slavery in North America left us with dominant institutions and established practices that continue to disadvantage Indigenous and Black peoples in Canada. And we heard in the first speaker, take us through some of the concepts and understandings of what individual racism is versus structural racism. And rooting it in a social context is so important. And what we don't name, we can't vanquish. And what we don't measure, we can't change. And so anti-racism actively seeks to identify, remove, prevent, and mitigate racially inequitable outcomes and power imbalances between groups to change the structures that sustain those inequities. To do that, we need to explicitly name anti-Black racism with an appropriate evidence-based approach that can help us to achieve those systems change with intentional leadership and long-term commitment to active and comprehensive progress. So I want to speak next to the importance of laws and standards to establish clear purposes for race and identity-based data. We saw from our previous speaker how useful and yet we have a long way to go when it comes to appropriately disaggregating data in a way that is relevant to people's lived experiences. And we need to set guardrails against the misuse of data as well, and how to center the voices and perspectives of those who are affected by systemic racism in all of its particular forms, such as anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism, but also in other forms that intersect with religion, such as anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. In Canada, we have provincial and federal human rights codes and acts that are primary legislation, and that is all underpinned by the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So it's like a Bill of Rights that supersedes everything. And these human rights codes and acts, by what I mean by primary legislation is that they are set up so that if there are any other statutes or legislations that conflict with the principles and clauses of human rights code, the human rights code takes precedence over them, right? So that gives a lot of power and precedence to the importance of protecting human rights and equity in public life. Ontario and British Columbia, two provinces in Canada, both have introduced anti-racism acts. So this is recognizing the specific barriers as a result of systemic racism and legislating data standards in order to enable and mandate race and identity-based data collection, analysis, and reporting for the clear purpose of eliminating systemic racism and advancing equity across all public services and programs. We heard the importance of taking a collective systems approach, and that's what these acts and data standards hope to accomplish. And they are critical tools to help us have concrete legislated enforceable rules to be responsible, transparent, and accountable to the public and support that collective impact approach. These provinces establish consistent data standards with mechanisms to protect privacy and involve communities through engagements. And to support all of this, underpinning all of this is the development of anti-racism strategies and action plans at both the provincial and national level that explicitly names and recognizes specific forms of systemic racism that are of unique concern in the Canadian context and in the global context, I would argue. Anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism. We also see an explosion of anti-Asian racism with the COVID pandemic. And we consistently see the emergence of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in our societies as well. And so taking a one-size-fits-all approach would not be effective and would not address the particular roots and expressions of these forms of racism. To have concrete and sustainable solutions that actually change outcomes for people, we need to understand the different forms and impacts that these systemic racisms take. And that means collecting the right data and analyzing it in a disaggregated way. So, for example, the UN has long criticized Canada's approach to using an aggregate category that we call visible minority to refer to anyone who is non-white and non-Indigenous. It is encoded in the Employment Equity Act at the federal level, and the government collects it that way in our census. And it has long been seen as inadequate to understanding the specific forms of systemic racism that I just named. So now the federal government is undertaking public consultations to review how it collects race-related data and the concepts that it collects in the national census and statistics. So going forward, we can have better disaggregated data to accomplish the purposes for which we want that data to do. So let me give you a concrete example of what disaggregated race statistics can reveal to us in order to take actions to end anti-Black racism. Ontario's regulation was designed to address the school to child welfare to prison pipeline. And the data standards, the Ontario data standards, which I was a part of a team to establish, mandates disaggregated race-based data. And the purpose and function of disaggregated data and analyzing it to address specific forms of systemic racism, like anti-Black racism, is to help take a targeted universalism approach. That means that, by developing, having clear universal goals, but through targeted strategies that address the most vulnerable population. And by removing barriers that lift the most disadvantaged communities, we support everyone to achieve shared goals, right? That's the concept behind targeted universalism approach. So let's take a look at how the Toronto District School Board is aiming for racial equity in education. The Toronto District School Board is Canada's largest school board. Because it's in Ontario, it is under the Anti-Racism Act, and which mandate all school boards to collect and analyze educational outcomes to ensure that there's equity in educational success and achievements for all students. And particularly in their reporting and analysis, there is a recognition that we needed to focus specifically on educational success for Black students. The data shows that Black and Indigenous students experience unique forms of systemic racism and barriers in schools. Black students who scored in the highest rank for reading on the standardized tests were a group that was also less likely to be evaluated by their teachers as being excellent, right? Compared to white students who similarly scored high in reading, they were much more likely by their teachers to be evaluated as students. So we see that Black students were not being evaluated fairly, and they were also more likely to be placed in non-academic streams. That those are specific programs that are less advanced and less likely to be streamed into university, despite having higher grades. Another form of inequities that we can see through the data, and I'll show you a few choice statistics to show you how aggregated statistics tells us almost nothing. Right. So the school boards, reported on suspension and expulsion rates in the Toronto District School Board, and they found that for all racialized students, so this is all students who were not white, they were 1.1 times more likely to be suspended or expelled from school relative to their presence in the school population. Well, racialized is such a broad category. It doesn't, help. Well, are there different outcomes for different groups? And so when we start to disaggregate it, we can see that actually the disparity is even larger for Latino students, who are 1.4 times more likely to experience expulsion or suspension in schools relative to their presence in the student population. And for Black students, that disparity was a whopping 3.3 times more likely to be suspended and expelled. So you can see from these numbers that we need specific strategies to address the pernicious effects of anti-Black racism in schools. And that means using data that best meets the needs of Black students, and a failure to take into account the differences within those the broad category of racialized, we risk making, the Simpsons paradox, right? You're familiar with that. That's where we, draw conclusions from a big category where, if we look into the finer details, the trends and would be different, and we would draw the wrong conclusions by not looking at the disaggregated data. And so this is a simple illustration of the importance of disaggregated data to identify impacts of policies and programs and procedures that might result in different outcomes for different groups, particularly addressing anti-Black racism. It is a critical tool that we need to use to identify, monitor, and track differences in the outcomes of students. And I mentioned the school to prison pipeline, right? So how does suspensions and expulsions of Black students feed into their higher likelihood and vulnerability of going into the criminal justice system later on in life? How do we fail these students by failing to support them and meet their needs in schools? And we can see in my work with the Toronto Police Service that we do have an overrepresentation of Black people in policing. And when there's interactions with officers, the report that we recently released in June shows that we were more likely to use force. Police officers were more likely to use force when interacting with Black people. And this was the trend, whether it was in response to a 911 call for service that relates to violent incidents or mental health crises. Right, we saw the disparities were particularly pronounced when there was mental health related incidents involving Black people. And so that report and the approach to disaggregated data, using data to really identify where police was failing to serve community safety needs of particular communities, has provided an opportunity for the service to understand the actions and have conversations with communities on what the solutions could be. We just finished a series of town halls because involving communities in that solution-oriented approach and developing tools and identifying what areas needed to be changed and how to change the culture of policing and how police can work better with communities is really central. Currently, as we heard, there are few indicators that include collecting analysis and reporting of disaggregated race or ethnicity in the global indicator framework for the Sustainable Development Goals. This is a major oversight in a nation's ability to even see the problems of systemic racism, never mind be able to address them and to be held accountable for making change that is relevant to people's lived experiences. To do that means taking an intersectional approach, and we heard about that as well. We need to recognize that different systems combine in ways that have unique impacts for different people that are based on their gender, ethno-racial identities, abilities, immigration status, class, etc. It means collecting the necessary information and using it in ways that allow us to understand how these factors may have unequal outcomes and what we can do about it. The suspension data that I just mentioned earlier, I didn't show you the rates for boys and girls, but it so happens that it was majority boys who were experiencing suspensions and expulsions from schools. How are we failing boys? And how are we failing Black boys specifically, right? Who are heavily affected by how schools respond to misconduct. Of particular concern is that a quarter of suspensions and expulsions in schools involve police. So this then intersects into the work I do and how it shows up in police data, in that young Black men were more likely to have interactions with police of a certain nature. So we need to work across sectors, policing sector, working with the school, the education sector, to look at how schools are managing disciplinary matters and how police are showing up in those situations. The school to prison pipeline begins there. And so in the Toronto Police Service, we are committed to taking that collective impact approach to understanding specific forms of and addressing anti-Black racism to improve the outcomes that we want to see with our communities. We published these reports and we also published the very first open data of its kind in Canada. The Toronto Police Service is immensely proud of that work and pushing the boundaries to show the power of data to drive progressive change. And that begins with a community-focused and community-led process in how we use data. I end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Phan. Again, questions are rolling in, but what I think is many are picking up on is the overlap in themes and issues that have been raised by some of our other presenters that are ripe for discussion as you talk about Toronto and we hear about Mexico and we hear about a whole of society approach. There are themes that are interlinking all of your presentations. And so I know this is going to be very fertile ground. So I'm going to quickly move to our last presenters so that we can give some of these questions airtime so that you all can get to them. Our last presenter is Dr. Sheri Levy. Sheri is a professor of psychology at Stony Brook University. She is also a SPSSI team member. For almost 30 years, she's conducted basic and applied research with children, adolescents, and adults to understand and reduce stereotyping, prejudice, discrimination, and intergroup conflict. Her presentation today is entitled Collecting and Using Disaggregated Data on Environmental Risks, Exposures, and Harms to Improve Policies and Practices to Combat Climate Racism. And then after Sheri's presentation, we're going to quickly turn to the questions so that we can all get a chance to hear your responses to some of the many excellent questions that have been put in our chat. Sheri, please proceed.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted and honored to be part of this side event. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about climate racism. In keeping with Dr. Phan, I'd like to acknowledge that New York City is the ancestral and traditional homelands of the Lenape people who are violently displaced. We honor and pay respect to Lenape people past and present, and Indigenous people past and present. Climate change causes food and water shortages, damage or loss of housing and infrastructure, destruction of agricultural land, and an increase in traumatic stress, injuries, and death. Climate injustice refers to how some groups and countries are shouldering a disproportionate burden of climate change. Climate racism refers to communities of African descent and color facing disproportionately greater exposure to environmental harms, less access to environmental goods, benefits, and information, and lower participation in environmental decision-making. Climate racism is systemic. Depicted here is the ecological systems model, which highlights how individuals are nested in proximal contexts, such as their communities, to increasingly distal contexts, such as their country and the world. The double arrow highlights that these contexts dynamically interact with one another across an individual's lifetime and historical time. This approach was adopted by SPSSI's anti-racism campaign, as Dr. Deborah Fish Ragin noted earlier. This approach calls attention to how racism is deeply embedded within and across all systems, laws, policies, and practices that produce, condone, and perpetuate the oppression, marginalization, and exclusion of people of African descent and color. In addition, individuals experience climate injustices through multiple identities. Some examples are African girls, African older women, African gay men, Indigenous persons living with disabilities. With this systems approach, collecting and reporting disaggregated data on environmental risks, exposures, and harms by race, Indigenous identity, and other identities are absolutely essential to making the necessary improvements in policies and practices to combat climate racism at all levels. Without disaggregated data, group differences are covered up and rendered invisible. Policies and programs are uninformed and ill-informed. Individual and group needs are unmet, and racism is perpetuated. Looking at a data-driven approach of climate racism across levels, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, released a huge report, over 3,000 pages, compiled by 270 researchers from 67 countries. Let me highlight a few things. First, the report underscored the highest vulnerability to climate hazards for individuals from West, Central, and East Africa, along with South Asia, Central and South America, small island developing states, and the Arctic. They also highlight the vulnerability exacerbated by inequity and marginalization and influenced by historical and ongoing patterns of inequity, such as colonialism, especially for many indigenous peoples and communities. And I've highlighted colonialism here because this is the very first time any IPCC report has mentioned colonialism. This report also notably and significantly featured more scientists of color, women scientists, social scientists, and included more Indigenous authors. Despite this long report, there are serious and ongoing data collection gaps. In this bar graph, we see that data availability is lagging behind the most for Goal 13, climate action. Only 20% of the 193 countries or areas have at least one data point since 2015 on climate action. This bar graph is about overall data, not disaggregated data. The graph would look far worse for the reporting of disaggregated data by race, ethnicity, and Indigenous identity. Data disaggregation occurs not only in national household surveys, but from grassroots organizations and social scientists, as others have noted. As one example, social scientists in the United States have conducted detailed case studies revealing, for example, disproportionate placement of waste facilities, toxic dumping, and environmental polluting power plants in communities of color in the United States, leading to disproportionate exposure to life-threatening
États-Unis, ce qui génère une exposition
pollutants in their air,
terrible.
food, soil, and water,
Por
which leads
ejemplo,
to health
la comida
disparities, including
afecta a la
higher
comida,
rates of asthma,
afecta al suelo.
cancer,
Entonces vemos
respiratory
tasas
diseases,
mayores.
and other illnesses and premature death. As another example, nationwide
Nous
disaster
n'avons plus la
evacuation
traduction.
plans and rescue and recovery efforts are disproportionately worse in communities of color in the United States, leading to disproportionate injury and
arrêté
mortality, increased likelihood
la
of becoming a
traduction,
climate
l'option de
refugee,
traduction.
greater vulnerability to long-term health issues, and less likelihood to receive food, housing vouchers, and federal aid. Data in action informing practices and policies. The 27th Conference of the Parties, COP27, just completed in Egypt, notably in Egypt. The Climate Justice Pavilion and the Children and Youth Pavilion were situated for the very first time in the main conference area to maximize interactions with policymakers. These pavilions spotlighted the rarely heard voices, experiences, and policy needs of vulnerable communities, including of African descent and color and Indigenous persons who have been disproportionately impacted by environmental injustices and climate racism. COP27, for the very first time, had climate justice elevated to the formal agenda. And the conference concluded with an agreement to establish a landmark loss and damage fund in which wealthier, high-polluting countries who disproportionately cause climate change will make good on longstanding commitments to payments to climate-vulnerable countries who disproportionately face climate-fueled extreme weather consequences. We need action right away, and let's take a look at a few recommendations for making tangible progress. First, we need to collect and report more disaggregated data by scaling up efforts to collect and report reliable data on environmental risks, exposures, and harms of poor, vulnerable, marginalized, and the hardest to reach communities, including persons of African descent and color, as well as individuals of all ages facing climate injustices. Increasing financial and human resource investment in local, national, and global statistical systems, and innovative online platforms that allow for transparent, easily accessible, and privacy-protected databases of environmental exposure, risk, harms, disaggregated by race and Indigenous identity and other identities. We need to put disaggregated data into action in policies and practices. Using data, identifying vulnerable groups to effectively invest in climate emergency responses, as well as crisis interventions, policies, and programs to successfully mitigate climate injustices and restore human rights. Investing in short-term and long-term planning that incorporates environmental justice goals, including establishing policies and programs that prevent future environmental injustices and human rights violations in local communities in environmental hazard zones. We need to respect and secure human rights by focusing on an inclusive human rights-based approach to environmental issues. We need to scale up efforts to increase the participation of and decision-making of individuals from all age groups who are the most vulnerable, marginalized, and facing climate injustices. We need to increase honest, transparent, and inclusive collaboration on the collection, reporting, and the use of climate-related data among interdisciplinary, local, national, and global stakeholders, centered on listening to and collaborating with local communities. We also need to utilize a restorative justice approach by focusing on recognizing historical and contemporary acts of climate racial injustices with apologies at the local, community, country, and global levels, along with investing in mitigation and adaptation at the local, community, country, and global levels, along with providing reparations at all levels. And finally, we need to address the mental health needs by focusing on scaling up local mental health services to individuals of all ages facing climate injustices and the uncertainties and anxieties of traumas of environmental risk and exposures. And finally, increasing financial and human resource investment at all levels. I'd like to end by acknowledging our wonderful SPSSI UN team, our collaborators from APA, as well as the SPSSI Policy Director. And thank you all for this opportunity to speak about climate racism.
Thank you so much, Sheri, and you've actually cut off 2 minutes of the time at the end, so I appreciate that, and recognizing our team members and our collaborators. I want to quickly get to questions, and I'm asking the forbearance of our presenters, because there are a couple that I think pose an opportunity for you all to join in the discussion. And about the question and how it relates to the work you've done. But very quickly, one person asked specifically about new and specific global indicators that advocate and monitor data disaggregation by race and ethnicity to address systemic racism. There are two, so I just wanted to provide that information. The SDG 17.18, that would be the target of 0.18, and the introduction generally speaks to it, and also SDG 10.2. So if the person would like to take a look at those. I'd like to ask our presenters if they can come back on screen for me, Dr. Phan, Ms. Schmitz, and Dr. Haynes-Mendez. If you can come back on screen for me, thanks so much. Do we have Dr. Phan? I hope we will soon. This question is actually targeted a bit more to Dr. Phan and to Ms. Schmidt. Both of you talked about the difficulties in collecting data, and you're both working in that arena pretty intensely. Ms. Schmidt, you talked about it in terms of the need to train interviewers and to get good quality data, but the reluctance of people sometimes to acknowledge their identity in the ways in which you've characterized them. And Dr. Phan spoke to the issue of inability to get good data unless you really pull apart and disaggregate on the basis of ethnicity. It seems to me it's a little bit of a push and pull. Can you speak to how you would recommend in Mexico to get around the problem that people have of maybe not wanting to identify as Afro-descendant or Afro-Mexican?
Okay, I will start if you want. The problem that we have identified on the field is not so much that Afro-descendant or Afro-Mexican people do not declare themselves as Afro-descendant. The problem is with people that are not Afro-descendant or Afro-Mexican. They don't understand what the terms mean. So that we made a very specific training, and we added in the mobile device that definition, so the enumerators won't try to explain in their own words what an Afro-descendant or an Afro-Mexican is, because in the previous test field that we made, we even heard that one of our informant that was not an Afro-descendant asked what that was, and our interviewer said, if you have family in Africa. So that is not what we want. So that's why we added that definition. And it is true that in the regions of the country where there is a more Afro-descendant population, we do not perceive any problems. So people identify themselves as indigenous people or Afro-descendants. But we have to continue to inform all the population that in Mexico we have Afro-descendant communities, and they have to be attended just as well as indigenous communities and the rest of the population. And with many Afro-Mexican organizations that we've worked that are aware of this invisibilization that those communities have, we were telling them that also the census allowed that for the first time in every dwelling on the country, everybody heard the term Afro-Mexican and Afro-descendants. So that is also important for us. And to continue the collection of this information, the disaggregation in particular in the census, but also that we have that this information is used for policy making, because the census was, the intercensal survey already had the question. Now the 2020 census will have it. We hope that the 2025 population count will have it. and then that this continuity will allow to see if those policies are effective or where exactly they are needed.
Thank you. Dr. Phan, you spoke of Canada's use of visible minorities, and that kind of ticked off the UN. Why did they choose that? What was the rationale for choosing it? Was there an intention to be unoffensive, or was there some other motive there?
That's a great question, and I mean, it was established in the 90s, and I think at that time, Canada we just weren't at the place where we were sophisticated in understanding systemic racism and understanding the unique forms of specific racism that are rooted in so much in our histories, and maybe we just weren't there yet, politicians and the statistics bodies. And so, it was really encoded in the Employment Equity Act, to protect against systemic discrimination in employment along various identity markers, and included gender, included disabilities, included Indigenous identity, and then visible minorities, right? So a very sweeping category that was used, and then that just became encoded in how we collect information in the census. And since from the beginning, there were a lot of pushback, that was inadequate. We know that people of Asian descent, African descent, from different race groups experience different challenges, and for different reasons and in different ways. And so it wasn't just the UN. UN was the most high-profile criticism, but community leaders throughout since the 90s have been pushing for a better way of collecting this information. So Ontario took the lead and went for it. And I was part of the work to identify, and it is, you're right, there is a lot of push and pull. How granular do we get? How meaningful? If we get too granular and everyone fills in exactly how they self-identify, you start to have really messy data and messy. You can't do the statistics work that you need to do to understand certain phenomena. And so, we took a step back and asked ourselves, what is the phenomena we are really trying to understand through statistics, right? And so what is the purpose are we going to use specific data points for? And maybe, it is unreasonable to ask for one kind of variable to do all the work of understanding systemic racism and all of its different facets. And so that begins by recognizing that, first of all, what is racism rooted in? Rooted in stereotypes by, phenotypical, often very shallow observations of other person, and we attach stereotypes and prejudices and biases to that, right? But to understand someone as a person more completely from an ethnocultural perspective, then we need that granularity, right? And so then perhaps that is a job for a different variable, such as ethnic or cultural origin, right? Indigenous identity. We know that the Indigenous bucket is very broad. It's there for a reason, because our, Canada is founded on lumping and stereotyping all First Nations people as, as a singular group, when in reality it is hundreds and hundreds of diverse and rich, culturally rich nations across this big, vast country. And so, Indigenous identity and First Nations and Inuit community identity is a different variable. And we need to collect them differently because they serve different purposes to understand different things. And we could intersect them. If you have, for example, Jamaicans who are racially white or racially Chinese, because of their the background of migration and their family history in Jamaica, and they come to Canada and self-identify as Jamaican. But they're all going to have different experiences with systemic racism in Canada. And so, ethnic origin and race can intersect and reveal unique experiences for different people. And so we really tightened the concept of race and say this is what race is. It's a social construct based on physical descriptors. And so when we describe it that way, and it helps us understand systemic racial bias, people get it, right? They're like, yeah, I when you're in a particular bucket, you know you're in a particular bucket, not because you identify that way, but because you're treated that way. And, you know, and people who have experienced racialization as a process, you know it, you know, and so even if you don't identify with that bucket, you know that that's the category that impacts your experiences and how people treat you. And so by selecting that bucket, it's not so personal, but it helps to reveal something about your experience. And so, you know, explaining and talking it about that way really helps to clarify things, and it helps us to collect and support people to collect data in a way that supports good, good statistics.
Thank you so much. That pivots nicely to Dr. Haynes-Mendez when you spoke about a whole of society approach, and yet Ms. Schmitz and Dr. Phan have both indicated that, you know, there are ways in which trying to get people to understand this terminology, not necessarily the people to whom it applies, but to others, there's a little bit of a challenge. What does that mean when you say a whole of society, when people are not grasping what's being talked about, or don't see the distinctions, or maybe don't understand them? What does that say?
Right. Well, I think that some of the language that we are using, more contemporary forms of language in and around systemic racism, also include social determinants. And so social determinants of health and health outcomes for marginalized communities, right? So there are systemic and racialized outcomes in maternal health. There are systemic and racialized outcomes for the experience of poverty and the impact of poverty, and responses and experiences of climate justice also. And so I think it's really important, again, just to reiterate that, you know, racism is an attitude about ourselves, about others, and then racism occurs across society in social determinants and outcomes for those communities. And so that sort of whole of society approach has a greater impact to resolving some of the outcomes of systemic racism. I think a really good example of this is implicit bias attitudes. So if we focus on changing attitudes, that doesn't necessarily translate into changing or having an impact on society. So there's not a straight line from my attitude about, or my attitudes of anti-Blackness, for instance, to changing an institution's sort of racialized outcomes for success and contributions to society. And so we have to look at both, and, you know, all four levels, I think, of racism in order to have a really solid impact and outcome. Because if we are only targeting, you know, attitudes and interpersonal experiences, we're not necessarily getting to the full society response and impact for these sort of systemic whole of society experiences of racism and discrimination.
Thank you. And there's one last question that came in that just looks like it encapsulates a lot of some of the questions that were raised before. Preface first by saying that there are a number of comments that came in about other countries, particularly England, where there's some work being done on the kind of disaggregation data that Ms. Schmitz and Dr. Phan specifically spoke on, and the need to share. They did acknowledge that maybe the work is not as advanced or as far along, but very strong interest in sharing. And so there's been a request that we share some of the information that was presented in the chats so other people can see as well. And Ms. Schmitz, you also invited people to share in the public comment period for in Jenny and up to December 5th, and that might be a fertile ground for cross-fertilization. But the last question that came in, and again, this doesn't represent all of them, there were quite a few, is how does socioeconomic status and have impact, I believe this, let me just make sure I got this right. How does socioeconomic status affect racialized outcomes and racial inequity? And I think that is a challenging question because it really is something that people struggle with. So anyone that wants to go on that first, how does socioeconomic status affect racialized outcomes and racial inequity? It's a tough one, I know, but someone wants to take a stab. Dr. Phan. Okay.
I was seeing if others had wanted to start first, but I'll jump in, get this started. That's a great question, and this is where that intersectionality comes in, right? We need to look at and compare people within socioeconomic class, for example, and see if there is a hierarchy or a rank of different outcomes by race to see which, if there is, would indicate that race matters even within a social class, right? And I've done some of that work in my earlier career when I looked at employment outcomes, income achievement, education achievement, and comparing against parents' income levels and achievement. And so you try to factor in some of the things that could influence a person's outcome that may be conflated with or confounded or mediated by race. And by doing that, you can start to see, okay, race matters, or race continues to matter, or it matters less. And we do see that. And so we have to take into account different factors to try to answer different questions about when does race matter and for whom, right? As we go up into higher socioeconomic categories, like for some groups, like Black people, continue to experience, discriminatory treatment. And in certain spaces, like certain professions, in fact, the higher the profession you go, the more you're going, people were reporting experiences of interpersonal discrimination, probably because they are the minority there, right? And for other groups like East Asians, East Asians, particular social, certain groups like Japanese in Canada, tend to do very well from an income, economic perspective. And within that, though, there's certain microaggressions continue to experience, right? But not as much as you might see someone who's Indigenous or who has Black, racial backgrounds, who continue to experience microaggressions and anti-Blackness at a higher rate. And so, it really is complex, and taking that intersectional lens is key to that. And you cross that with gender. Black women, Black men experience the workplace quite differently, even within the same profession. So thank you for asking that question.
Ms. Schmitz, I'm going to forward this question to you and say your data clearly showed for example, in Guerrero, where there are some real significant economic differences among the population of people there. How would you respond to the question?
Well, it is clear, for example, that the municipality that I was showing to you, that there are important gaps in the context of living conditions for the persons, and that municipality in particular is 80% of the population recognize themselves as African descendant. Nevertheless, the important question will be, are those conditions because of the nature of the recognition of the population, or because there are other conditions, because there are other states in the country where there are indigenous people that also have those conditions, or other places where poverty is very present in the country, that have neither indigenous people or African descendant population. So that would be the big question: are those conditions because of the self-recognition? Because if you see, as I was showing you at the beginning, if you see the statistics for the 2 million persons that recognize themselves as Afro-Mexican or African descendants, the statistics have like the same levels as the national population it is only in certain regions of the country that this happens. And if you see that 46% of the African descendant population is concentrated in 3 or 4 states, and the national levels are higher, that means that in the middle, there are the rest of the African descendant population in Mexico have higher levels of education, living conditions. So the average, the national average is just like the rest of the country. So that will be important. Perhaps in Mexico, we also have this mixture of a lot of indigenous communities, African descendant. And for example, during the census, when we were asking the question, of course, a few persons were offended that we were asking that, but it was not the general situation. In general, the population, many of them didn't understand, but did not have a bad attitude about it.
Thank you. And Sheri, I'll give you the last rep on this one. SES, how does it affect racialized outcomes or inequality? And thinking of this through your lens of climate and environment.
Yeah, it definitely intersects SES and race and ethnicity and indigenous identity, as others have pointed out. And so in terms of climate racism, individuals who are facing poor outcomes are more likely to live in low-lying areas and more prone to flooding of their homes and their livelihood. They're more likely to live in areas that face droughts and storms. So it really intersects quite profoundly in terms of climate racism. And also, and that's at the global level, the country level, and certainly with a lot of emphasis on these issues in Africa, African countries in particular, but also is very relevant to within country data, such as some of the data that I mentioned very briefly in the United States. Case studies have looked at, it's more likely that poor individuals are living in vulnerable areas, that when hurricanes strike, their housing may not be of the same quality, such that they're more likely to face damage. They're less likely to be able to leave town if there's sufficient time for warnings. They're not able to travel. And there's not sufficient healthcare systems in their areas. So SES is a huge factor.
Thank you all. I have pushed your limits, I realize, because we were 20 minutes over, but the information that you brought to the table clearly was interesting and interesting to our listeners who asked a number of questions. Unfortunately, we could not get to all of them, but it really demonstrated a strong interest in the work that you're doing and the need to replicate this work on the global stage. Before we end, I just want to thank again our interpreting team led by Serapis Murillo. Serapis, thank you for your team for providing excellent service to us so that we could maximize our audience ability to access and understand this presentation. We want to also give a special thanks to SPSSI's Executive Director, Anila Bakasan, and to Sarah Mangold, who, in addition to being the policy expert, does a lot of our technical work behind the scenes and never quite gets to be shown up front. We want to give her a lot of thanks and support. Again, thanks to our partners at APA, our co-collaborators at APA, and to the missions who've been working with closely on these issues. And then last but not least, David, why don't you take us out?
Well, thank you, Debbie. First of all, sincere thanks to all of you who've attended this session. I know some of you had conflicts and had to leave. You'll see us in the recording, but those of you who are here, thank you. And thank you for helping create this community today. A formal bit of thanks to Dr. Kelley Haynes-Mendez, Dr. Phan and Dr. Carole Schmitz for their fantastic presentations and discussion today. Thank you to Dr. Sheri Levy as well. And Debbie Fish-Ragin did an unbelievably masterful job of guiding us through today's conversation. A few shout outs. Thank you to the APA team, Gabriel Tooze, Elizabeth Lewis, and Amanda Clinton for helping us make this happen, our co-partners. We also recognize behind the scenes the intense work and talents of Dr. Ani Sternisko, Wang, Allison Goldberg, and Yasmin Hussein, our 3 SPSSI youth representatives to the United Nations. We acknowledge the help of and support of the entire SPSSI United Nations team, and we must put a footnote next to everything we say because it is Dr. Karana Korodudu who really started this campaign and who continues to guide its success, and we thank you so much. SPSSI is a collection of several thousand social scientists around the world who who enthusiastically advocate for the inclusion of good social science and social policy with the goals of attaining social justice and human rights. SPSSI has maintained a team at the United Nations since the late 1980s. SPSSI has been involved at the United Nations since 1947, in which we started working on a prejudice and discrimination project with UNESCO. I also need to thank the Psychology Coalition of accredited NGOs at the United Nations, and also thanks to the Global Psychology Alliance, which also co-sponsored this event. And a final thought, this is a historic moment. This is one of the earliest virtual side events before the convening of the first permanent forum of people of African descent in Geneva in a few days. And in fact, if we are able to, we may have the opportunity to report some of the findings and discussions from this session at the permanent forum a week from today, as a matter of fact, in Geneva. It's a time in which we are reminded so much of the importance of moving forward, not just with the attainment of SDGs, but to align our best goals with also our concern for leaving no one behind and for reducing prejudice and discrimination around the world. And, you know, we are encouraged by the inclusion of this language in COP27 and climate injustice. But we certainly strive to do more. We thank you for being part of our community that we established today. We're absolutely committed to social justice, to the reduction of discrimination, and for us to the application of our best thinking and our best methods in the service of reducing prejudice and discrimination for all. Thank you very much for attending. There will be recordings available in the near future. And if you have registered for the event, you will receive a link to any of the materials that we're able to make available. So once again, I wish to all of you for a healthy December and for a peaceful December. And thank you so much for attending. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.